Mr. Mayor, my friends of Miami, I am not a stranger here because for a good many years I used to come down here. I haven't been here for 7 years, but on my coming back I have firmly resolved not to make it the last time.
The President-elect finishes his impromptu talk and prepares to drive on to the railway station when the startled onlookers suddenly realize what has happened. Pandemonium reigns, and the crowd, led by American legionnaires in their glistening helmets, counts assassin Zangara. William Sinnott, one of the injured, makes his way out of the crowd on the left. Mayor Cermak, critically wounded, is carried to Mr. Roosevelt's car. Resting in the arms of the President-elect, he is rushed to a hospital. They've got him. The Secret Service men load him on the rear of the car and hustle him away to jail. Now, the heroine, the woman whose courage all the world applauds. She probably saved Mr. Roosevelt's life by deflecting the assassin's aim. Mrs. W.F. Cross of Miami.
Like a crazy man. My first thought was to get it. I knew he was shooting at the president, so my first thought was to get the pistol up in the air so he wouldn't hurt any of the bystanders.
Why you killed Mr. Roosevelt? What for in your mind?
I told before. I have all time in the mind I get capitalists to kill me. I suffer from this thing in the stomach for the capitalist. So also for the capitalist I know I have this sickness in my stomach.
He make you work.
He make me work.
Joe, you get a chance tonight. You would shoot the president tonight?
I can't shoot no more.
If you give you a chance.
I should give him a chance, I should, yeah.
You don't like him for president.
That's all.
As a man, he's all right.
The man is all right, but the president is all right.
Hello, and welcome back. It's been a little bit since I've done a show, but that is because I have been hard at work on the book, which is actually done at this point. What I'm doing now is I am going through the editing phase, and I'm finding that some of my earliest writings, particularly on the Winterland and on the Three Tramps, which I did almost 2 years ago, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. So I'm taking probably the next week or so to basically go through those 2 chapters and rewrite and add some stuff to them because they just don't match the quality of the rest of the book. So, that being said, today what we're going to do is we are going to take a little break from the assassination, but not really. Not really, because the assassination story, as I've said before, begins in the late 1800s. And this falls well within that time frame. Today we're going to talk about the assassination of Mayor Anton Cermak, the mayor of Chicago, who made some unholy alliances that ended up getting him killed. I don't know, what is he called? Is it the protagonist, the antagonist, whoever the bad guy is, right? The bad guy in the story is Giuseppe Zangara. Funny guy. And so, let me just not even try to give you my interpretation. What we're going to do is we're going to go over this series of articles by John Tuohy called The Guns of Zangara. Really fascinating stuff. I consider this to be like the first of a series of parallel assassinations. Started with Mayor Anton Cermak, then it moved on to Huey Long, and then Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and the rest, right? So, here we go. The Guns of Zangara by John Tuohy. Almost 70 years ago, an enigmatic Italian immigrant bricklayer named Giuseppe Zangara momentarily leaped onto history's stage and took a misguided shot at President-elect Franklin Roosevelt and accidentally killed Chicago's reform mayor Anton Cermak. Or so the story goes. But over the next 6.5 decades, the shooting only created more questions than it answered. Who was Zangara, and who was his intended victim, Anton Cermak, and did the Chicago mob order the killing? The recent discovery of lost government records can now answer those questions and forever seal the case of the Guns of Zangara. Like most mob murders, it started over money, greed, and the lust for power. In 1931, the labor rackets business in Chicago was worth $145 million, or about $500 million in today's value. In fact, unions were such easy prey for gangsters that before Prohibition, the mob saw control of labor unions, not bootleg beer, as the quickest route to riches. Now in 1931, with repeal closing in and the National Depression curbing the outfit's gambling business, Al Capone pulled out all the stops in his drive to control the labor unions in Chicago. Capone's goons invaded so many union locals that Frank Lesh, president of the Chicago Crime Commission, estimated that 2 out of every 3 unions in Chicago was run by Capone. As Capone terrorized his way into more Teamster locals, the union bosses fled out of suburban Des Plaines to live under mobster Roger Tuohy's protection. The Tuohy brothers, Roger, Tommy, and Eddie, were the last serious threat to Capone's might. The brothers, safely tucked away in the still mostly undeveloped portion of northern Cook County, had grown rich from prohibition and gambling and the ability to avoid big political payoffs and long drawn-out beer wars. By 1932, they had the money, the manpower, and the firepower to take over the entire Chicago Teamsters organization without having to split any of the proceeds with Capone. Patty Burrell, the Teamsters vice president, called a meeting of all the locals threatened by Capone and gave them a choice. They could stand alone against Capone and lose their unions and probably their lives, or they could move their operations under the Tuohy's protection. They would still lose a large portion of their treasury to the Tuohys, but at least they'd be alive. Most of the union bosses knew Roger Tuohy from their childhood. He had a solid reputation as a union organizer in his youth, and compared to Capone, at least, he was still evil. But at least he was the lesser of 2 evils. The bosses would go with Tuohy. After the meeting, Burrell sent union boss Jerry Horan to Roger's house with $75,000 in cash for a defense fund. Tuohy used that money plus an additional $75,000 from his own pocket to hire an army of thugs, killers, and goons to fend off Capone's pending assault. Tuohy's defiance didn't come without a price. The Capones killed one of the brothers and attempted to kidnap his children. Then on October 25th, 1931, the unbelievable happened. Al Capone was convicted of income tax evasion and sentenced to 10 years in prison. That same day, Matt Kolb, Tuohy's business partner and financier, as well as the source of Tuohy's enormous political clout, was gunned down by Capone gunmen inside the speakeasy, the Club Morton. With Kolb dead, the price for political protection went through the roof. Tuohy would have to find a Kolb replacement soon, and Anton Cermak was just off on the horizon. Tony Cermak was not a very nice man, wrote Judge Lyle of Chicago's mayor. He appeared to take pride in his lack of polish. He was uncouth, gruff, insolent, and inarticulate. He could engage in no more intelligent discussion of the larger political issues of the day than he could have the Einstein theory of relativity. In personal confrontation, Cermak was known as the bully and an intimidator with a violent temper, who'd never walk away from a dispute. He liked very few people and he trusted virtually no one. As his power grew, so did his paranoia. He wasn't a backslapper. He was elected because of a political survivor who simply outlasted his opponents. Those he couldn't outlast, he blackballed. In the Illinois State House, as president of Cook County and later as mayor, Cermak used wiretaps, stole mail, used secret surveillance and informants to get intelligence on the weakness of his enemies, and he took great care to know who his enemies were. He admitted to authorizing beatings of anyone that got in his way. Anthony 10% Tony Cermak was born May 7, 1873, in a Bohemian village about 50 miles outside of Prague. The family immigrated to America in 1884, settling in a Chicago slum on 15th and Canal, the infamous valley that had also produced the Tuohy brothers, and later in 1900 moved to Braidwood in southern Illinois, where the elder Cermak worked as a coal miner. In 1889, Tony Cermak returned to Chicago at age 16. Cermak was a hustler who saw his opportunity in the rough and tumble world of Chicago's ethnic politics. He organized the huge Bohemian community into a powerful voting machine, and before he was old enough to vote himself, Tony Cermak was a political power. Cermak was also a greedy man who wanted to be rich, and the roads he used to riches was to form an organization called the United Societies, a high-sounding name for nothing more than a shakedown operation. Every brewer and booze seller, dance hall operator, and saloon keeper was a member, as were most of the area's gunmen, pimps, prostitutes, and gamblers that worked along 22nd Street, later renamed, oddly enough, Cermak Road. They paid to belong to Cermak's organization because Cermak had the police and the politicians in his pocket. In 1928, Cermak, who was still the spokesman for organized liquor interests, decided to become mayor of Chicago. On Election Day, April 7, 1931, word went out from higher-ups in the Capone organization down to the goons and speakeasy owners to support Cermak. If Cermak won, the bosses said, the reformers would loosen up. Cermak did win. He trounced Thompson 667-529 to 475-613, the largest margin ever recorded in a Chicago mayoral election to date. But he double-crossed the people, too. On his first day in office, Cermak promised the people of Chicago that he would rid their city of gangsters before the Century of Progress exhibition opened in the summer of 1933. But Tony didn't want to get rid of organized crime in Chicago. He wanted to corral it, to dominate it, to run it, to own it, to grow rich from it, and he figured all he had to do was give it another face. So Tony Cermak threw his net around the city's multi-million-dollar gambling rackets. The first thing he did to corner the gambling market was to close down the competition. Seemingly overnight, Cermak's police force, which he dominated with his hand-picked loyalists, raided hundreds of syndicate gambling dens and casinos and shut them down. Independent gamblers, there were still a few in those days who refused to throw in with Cermak, were run out of business. Once Cermak had smashed the gamblers into submission, he would need someone dependable to act as his collector and street boss, the mayor's personal bagman. Enter Teddy Newberry, a lifelong gangster who had been with Bugs Moran, and then the Ios, and finally with Capone until his career ended. After several months of acting as Cermak's street supervisor, Teddy Newberry sat down with Anton Cermak in the summer of 1931 and worked out a deal. As Newberry and Cermak saw it, with Capone and most of his top men behind bars or on the run from the law, what was left of the syndicate would easily fall apart. The fact that Roger Tuohy was winning his shooting war against the mob was another plus for them. All that was left, according to Newberry, to topple the Chicago syndicate was to kill the head and then watch the body die. The head of the syndicate in 1933 was Frank Nitti. Once Nitti was dead, all other hoods would fall into line. Or so they thought. Francisco Nitti, or Frank Nitti as he preferred it, was a small-built, pensive little man with ulcers and a nervous twitch. He was born outside of Palermo in Italy, but he avoided discussing his Sicilian background, always calling himself an Italian instead. Nitti had gotten a full formal education in Italy before coming to the United States, which gave him a working knowledge of advanced chemistry, and he was also said to be a talented watchmaker. Although the newspaper referred to Nitti as the Enforcer, those who knew the real story, the nickname was almost comical. In fact, as far as anyone knows, Nitti never killed anyone. He made his way up through the ranks of the syndicate because he was smart, cunning, and obnoxious. At mid-morning on December 20th, 1933, Tony Cermak summoned two members of his special squad to his office, Harry Miller and Henry Lang. Miller and Lang were crooks, gangsters, and badges. Always had been. Harry Miller, who had once been dismissed from the force for trafficking in narcotics, was one of the notorious Miller brothers who headed up the Valley Gang. Henry Lang was a bagman for former Mayor Big Bill Thompson, and taught Miller the little bit he needed to know about being a crook when he came on the force by, quote, special political appointment back in 1927. Now, through political pull, they were both detective sergeants on his Cermak's special squad, a group of tough cops of questionable background tossed together to carry out Cermak's every whim. As Lang would later testify under oath, Cermak called them to his office and handed them a slip of paper with Frank Nitti's name and office address on it. Teddy Newberry was there sitting on the mayoral desk, smoking one of his small cigars. Newberry told the pair that he and the mayor had decided that it was time for Frank Nitti to die, and they had to do the killing. The slip of paper, he explained, was where Nitti would find, where they would find Nitti the most of the morning. Newberry said that once Nitti was dead, he would pay Miller and Lang $15,000 each. Good money for a pair of cops who were supposed to be making less than $100 a week. The detectives left City Hall and drove to Nitti's office at the LaSalle Wacker building at 221 North LaSalle, took the elevator to the 5th floor and walked to room 554 where Nitti kept a cramped 3-room office. Inside the office was Nitti and several underlings. Lang and Miller lined the hoods up against the wall, and very quickly Lang fired 5 shots into Nitti's leg, groin, back, and neck. Then Lang walked into the anteroom and fired a single shot through his own hand. The story would be that Nitti resisted arrest and lunged for Lang's service revolver and had to be shot. The mistake in shooting Nitti was that they didn't kill him. While it was true that the shooting had spooked what was left of the mob's leadership, Cermak and Newberry knew that once Nitti had recuperated that the outfit would strike back. What they needed now was a street fighter to fend off those pending attacks. Enter Roger Tuohy. Anton Cermak, who had known Roger Tuohy for decades, wanted Tuohy to join forces with him and Teddy Newberry to help them jointly run the underworld in Chicago and the Midwest. In 1959, Tuohy told the Illinois Parole Board that in early 1933, Newberry and Cermak called him down to City Hall for a discussion. In a meeting in the mayor's office, Cermak and Newberry urged Tuohy to wage a larger war with the mob, but Tuohy laughed it off, saying he didn't have the strength to fight the Nitti organization, which could muster at least 500 gunmen within a week's time. Cermak said you can have the entire police department. Tuohy eventually agreed, and Cermak lived up to his end of the bargain. He sent word down to his police commanders that Roger Tuohy was to be cooperated with in his war against the syndicate for control of the Chicago Teamsters. The number of Capone men killed after Cermak took office tripled in 2 years. Some 100 gangsters were killed in ambushes and street fights. For a while, the hoods fell at a rate of 1 gangland murder a day, with most of the dead coming from syndicate's ranks. James Doherty, a crime reporter for the Chicago Tribune, recalled it was a war chiefly between the Irish and the Italians. I'm Irish, and I'd come into my office in the morning after another shootout, and I would say to my coworker who was Italian, "Well, that's one to my side," and the next day he would come to my saying, "Well, it's leveled, Jim. We chalked one up on our side last night." For a while, it was going well for the upstarts, almost too well. The Tuohys gunned down the syndicate's lead laborer plunderer, Red Barker. The government jailed the equally deadly Murray Humphreys, and Cermak's boys shot down Frank Nitti. They were so close. They had chased the syndicate out of the Teamsters and had ready access to the pension funds. They owned City Hall and the cops. Then the tide started to turn. First, Teddy Newberry's dead body showed up on the bitter cold evening of January 7th, 1933. He was found lying face down in a ditch in Porter County, Indiana. After Newberry was killed, Tony Cermak lost his nerve. Tony was absolutely certain that the outfit had pegged Louis Short Pants Campagna, Al Capone's former bodyguard, was going to kill him. He may have been right. According to newsman Jack Late in 1933, the syndicate's hitman tried to blow up Cermak's car early one morning in the middle of Chicago's Loop. After that, Cermak beefed up his security forces and moved from the Congress Hotel to the Morrison Hotel, where he paid for a private elevator that went non-stop to his penthouse suite. He increased his city police guard from 2 to 5 officers and had detectives sent to protect his daughters, and hired on own private bodyguards to augment his city police detail, and then took a midnight train to Miami, where he owned a home. The job to end the Union War with the Tuohys and take out Anton Cermak fell to Paul Ricca, acting boss since Nitti had been shot. Ricca determined that the only way to deal with Cermak was to kill him. But knocking off the mayor of the nation's second largest city would bring down more heat on the mob than Cermak could ever have gathered, unless, of course, the murder could be thumbed off on a nutcase. The nutcase they found was Giuseppe Zangara, a hapless Italian immigrant with a gambling problem who was into the outfit for his eye teeth. Zangara was born September 7, 1900, in Ferruzano, a small and very poor village in Calabria, Italy. His mother died while he was still a small boy. His father remarried to a woman with 6 daughters, and Zangara, small, fragile, seldom smiling, and deathly quiet, was lost in the horde that was his new family. By all accounts, Zangara's father was an odd man, angry at the world. He had constant problems with authority and he beat his children. It was no surprise to anyone when at the age of 6, after Zangara's stepmother entered him into public school, that his father withdrew him 2 months later. When my father come, he say me like this. He say me, you don't need school, you need work. Zangara, the child, went to work beside his father building roads. Later he learned the work of bricklayer, which was in Italy of that time still most an art form and required years of apprenticeship. Apparently Zangara had an aptitude for the trade and at the age of 17 was already a mason, no small feat. Zangara, the somber and unhappy child, drew into Zangara, the somber and unhappy man, enraged at the world because he was poor and because he was taken from school as a child. He talked about his unhappiness openly and often during his trial, perhaps if for no other reason he finally had someone to listen to him. In 1917, Zangara, then 17, was drafted into the Italian infantry and stayed in the army for 5 years. While in the service, he was arrested on October 24, 1921 for carrying a knife. He was tried and convicted, but the sentence was suspended. Discharged from the military in 1923, Zangara sailed to the United States from Naples, arriving in Philadelphia aboard the liner Martha Washington on August 18, 1923, 5 days before his 23rd birthday. He went to Paterson, New Jersey, moved in with an uncle, Vincent Cafaro, a bricklayer who landed Zangara a job with the construction company that he had worked for. As a skilled laborer and a member of the Bricklayers Union No. 2 in Paterson, Zangara earned as much as $12 an hour, an extremely high hourly rate when the national income was less than $5,600 a year. He filed a declaration to become a citizen of the United States, doing so only because it was required by his union that all members be United States citizens or at least have filed to become citizens. The names of the witnesses on the declaration, 2 men, disappeared with most of the official information that surrounded Zangara's background, but on September 11, 1929, Zangara became a United States citizen and registered as a Republican. Later that month, on September 28th, someone named Giuseppe Zangara of Paterson, New Jersey, was arrested for running a massive 1,000-gallon still in rural New Jersey. When arrested, Zangara used the name Sam Livari, but later changed that to Luigi Di Bernardo. Arrested with him was Tony Agostino, a known racketeer in northern New Jersey. On May 26, 1930, Zangara and Di Bernardo pleaded guilty to owning the still and was sentenced to 1 year and a day at the Atlanta Federal Prison. During sentencing, United States Attorney Philip Foreman, later a federal judge, asked, "Your real name is Zangara, isn't it?" And Zangara answered that it was. The fact that the prosecutor knew Zangara by sight implies that Zangara wasn't a stranger around the federal courthouse. Di Bernardo Zangara entered Atlanta Federal Prison on May 26, 1930, and was paroled 7 months later on December 20th, 1930. Later, when the Secret Service investigated the Cermak shooting, they accepted Zangara's explanation for the missing 7 months as has been in Central America. Even more remarkably, when Philip Foreman, the U.S. Attorney, informed the Secret Service about Zangara's time in prison, the agents pulled Zangara's prison photo and compared it to a picture taken in Florida when he was arrested and determined that, quote, "They seem to match, however, our Zangara has a lower forehead, but otherwise they match." However, the investigating agent never followed up on the lead. When 1931 rolled around, Zangara started to change. He lost interest in his job and avoided people even more than he did in the past, and then, without any apparent reason, he left New Jersey for Florida. When he departed from New Jersey, he left hurriedly, leaving all of his possessions in the boarding house. In Florida, Zangara became a gambler, a degenerate gambler, betting most on the horses. When he gave up on the horses, Zangara turned to the dogs, and in one incident lost $200 in one night, a huge amount of money for anyone in the Depression-racked America of 1933, but a small fortune to an out-of-work bricklayer. On February 12, 1933, Chicago City Hall announced that His Honor Anton J. Cermak of Chicago would make an appearance in a Miami park at night to greet the arrival of President-elect Roosevelt. Thousands were expected to turn out for the event. It was a godsend for the mob. Rika sent down word to Dave Yoris, a transplanted Chicago hood, that they were going to whack Cermak, and Yoris had to line somebody up to take the fall for the murder, a patsy. Yoris reported back that he had just the man they needed. Dead broke, Zangara took a slot in Dave Yoris's highly secretive heroin smuggling operation in or about early 1932, when he was spotted regularly around the municipal docks. According to Reverend Elmer Williams, a Chicago minister who exposed political corruption in the Windy City during the Capone and Nitti reigns, Zangara worked in Rika's narcotics processing plant in extreme South Florida as a mule transporting narcotics up to New York, a city he knew well. In New York, Zangara turned the dope over to distribution specialists like Bugsy Siegel in Brooklyn, Longy Zwillman in Jersey, and others. He would collect the money for delivery and then return to Florida to run the entire cycle all over again. According to both Williams and Jack Late, while Zangara was on one of his runs to New York, he got spotted in a mob casino in Manhattan by a group of the New Jersey Hoods that he had cheated back in 1930. Now the boys from New Jersey had a make on him, and they brought their complaint to Rica since technically Zangara was under Chicago's protection. The New Jersey Hoods wanted him so they could kill him. Even if New Jersey didn't want him, Zangara had now been uncovered as an unreliable worker, a detriment in a racket as volatile as narcotics, so Yaris would have to deal with him. The boys sat Zangara down and explained his two choices. The mob could kill him right then and there, or Zangara could take his chances and shoot Cermak for them. Shooting Cermak, they explained, had its upside. Maybe the cops would kill him. Maybe the crowd would rip him to pieces. Or maybe he'd get lucky. Maybe he'd get caught after he killed Cermak. He could pretend he was insane, and at the most he might get 10, maybe 15 years on a farm for the mentally insane, and then he could walk, all debts forgiven. Someone had checked. Florida, second only to Texas, as Jack Ruby later pointed out, had the most lenient laws in the books in dealing with the mentally unstable criminals. Zangara may have actually believed that he was going to get away with it. When the Secret Service went into Zangara's room after the shooting, they found only a few personal items in his travel bag, which was left on his bed neatly packed. It included clothes and 3 books, the Wayman Brothers' Easy Method for Learning Spanish Quickly, Italian Self-Taught, and English-Italian Grammar book, and several newspaper clippings about Roosevelt's trip to Florida, and one about the Lincoln assassination conspiracy. But of course, the mob had no intention of letting Zangara walk away. According to Roger Tuwohi, the second after Zangara fired into Cermak, a mob assassin would plug Zangara and disappear into the crowd. The Miami police, Secret Service, or Cermak's private guards would get the recognition, whoever it was. The American public would hail them as a hero. Jack Late, a top Chicago reporter, noted that had Cermak escaped, Zangara's bullets and other triggermen would have gotten him. Late was right, of course, except there weren't going to be any mistakes, because Paul Rica, the mob's acting boss, wouldn't leave room for one to happen. Rica was sending his best killers down to Florida to make sure the hit went off correctly. 3 Fingers Jake White and Frankie Rio. 2 days before Anton Cermak was shot, a Chicago beat cop spotted White sitting inside the main terminal of the Chicago Railroad. Within minutes, several carloads of detectives were inside the station and had White and his companion, Frankie Rio, and ward politician Harry Stockstein up against the wall for a body search. The officers found nothing on the 3 smirking hoods except a bag of donuts and were forced to release them. White and Rio explained that they were on their way to Miami, Florida, for a short vacation. On February 14th, 1933, a day before the shooting, Zangara went to Davis Pawn Shop in downtown Miami and spent $8 on a .32 revolver and 10 bullets. Gordon Davis, the Miami pawnbroker who sold Zangara his gun along with 10 bullets, admitted that he had a criminal record in Chicago and that he had known about Zangara for a long time. Gordon said he didn't ask Zangara why he felt the need to purchase the revolver. "I ain't no wet nurse, pal," he told Secret Service investigator. While still in the store, he placed 5 bullets in the chamber and kept 5 in his pocket. Then Zangara started talking Cermak. On the day of the shooting, about 11:30 in the morning, Zangara went to Bostic Hotel at 217 South Miami Avenue near the park and rented a room. He paid $1 for the night and was assigned to room 4. Before he entered the room, Zangara asked to see all of the exits and entrances to the hotel. Then he went to his room, left the door open, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared down the hallway towards the front door of the hotel. By 6:30 that evening, Zangara was gone. What Zangara knew, although it has never been established how he knew, was that the hotel was owned by Horace and May Bostic, close friends to Anton Cermak, and that they expected the mayor to drop by that evening before going to greet the president. Zangara's object in coming here, May Bostic later told Secret Service, was to kill Cermak. From the hotel, Zangara walked several blocks to a cigar manufacturing plant owned by Andrea Valenti, an immigrant from Sicily who had once lived in Chicago. Zangara and Valenti left the plant about 7:30 p.m., walking to Bayfront Park. With them were Steve Valenti and Lorenzo Grandi, all Sicilian immigrants. The Valentis and Grandi were arrested after the Cermak shooting, questioned, and released. With 40 acres of palm trees and open lawns edged onto Biscayne Boulevard, Bayfront Park was a perfect place for a political rally and an assassination. At its south end, the park held an amphitheater with some 8,000 seats. At the very end of the amphitheater was a flat bandstand, and in the back of that stage were dignitaries, including Cermak, where they waited for the president-elect's arrival. By the time Zangara arrived, the park was jammed to standing room only crowd of about 15,000 people. They had miscalculated badly. No one figured, not even the police, on such a large turnout. Desperate Zangara, the Valentes, and Grandi began to push, shove, and kick their way through the crowd so they could reach the bandstand. Anton Cermak wasn't feeling well that night. While in Chicago, some bad water from a nearby canal had seeped into his hotel's water reserves, and Cermak had drunk it, giving him a stomach infection. A lesser man would have canceled the night's engagement, but Tony Cermak had always been an extraordinary man. Yet when a bodyguard handed him his bulky black bulletproof vest, Cermak said he didn't want it. It was too humid outside, and he was too weak to carry its weight. At 9:25 that evening, Roosevelt's car entered the park and stopped next to the bandstand area where Cermak and the other dignitaries were seated. It was warm that night. The humidity that hung in the air was almost stifling. The coconut trees and royal palms that covered the park were bathed in red, white, and blue lights, giving the entire scene an eerie feel to it. At that same moment, Zangara and his party had pushed their way up to the second aisle from the bandstand and were less than 35 feet away from Roosevelt's car, where Zangara had a clear view of FDR, whose back was to Zangara. Roosevelt was lifted out of his seat and slid on the top of the trunk, dressed in a white suit, with a sole floodlight beaming down on him. He was the perfect target. He spoke to the crowd for about 8 minutes, and when the speech ended, looked up onto the reviewing stand and saw Cermak sitting in the front row and waved for him. "Tony, come on down here." Smiling broadly, Cermak stood up from his chair and walked down to FDR. As he did, his bodyguards rose up with him and stepped up to join him, but Cermak told him to stay on the stage. It was, he said later, unseemly for the mayor of Chicago to have more bodyguards than the president of the United States. Cermak walked up to Roosevelt's side of the car, the side facing Zangara, and the two politicians shook hands and chatted for about 3 minutes. They shook hands and agreed to talk later. It was now about 9:35. Cermak stepped away from the car and turned to his right and briefly embraced Secret Service agent Clark with his left arm. Cermak and Clark had known each other when Clark was assigned to the Chicago office of the Secret Service. There was a brief exchange, a quick joke between them, and then, for some unknown reason, Cermak walked towards the crowd to his left, away from the stage. Perhaps, as Judge Lyle suggested, Cermak spotted Harry Hochstein, the politician who was questioned in the Chicago train station with Nitty Shooter the night before. Harry Hochstein had grown rich off of city policies to afford a mini-mansion in the upscale neighborhood of Riverdale next to Frank Nitty's place. In fact, it was Hochstein's home that the outfit met in 1934 and decided to go through with the Brown and Buyoff Hollywood extortion scandal, and a year later in December met there again and decided to kill union boss Tommy Malloy. Hochstein, it was widely known, was run by Frankie Rio. Whatever the reason, Cermak took clearly over a dozen steps away from the stage where he was sitting and walked toward the position where Zangara was standing. The very second Cermak stepped away from the car, a group of local businessmen carrying with them an immense imitation telegram welcoming FDR to Florida surrounded the car, unknowingly forming a human shield around the president-elect. At that moment, a tall blonde woman who had been sitting in the first aisle got up and left her seat. Zangara leaped up onto the empty seat, drew his revolver from his pant pocket, and fired rapidly, letting off 5 rounds, pointing the gun to his left at Cermak and not to his right at Roosevelt. The first bullet hit Cermak in the right armpit, causing Cermak to grab his chest with both arms and slowly sink to his knees. Several other bystanders were struck by bullets as well. Zangara said over and over, and the Miami police agreed, that he never got off more than 3 rounds from the pistol. Furthermore, Zangara's pistol was manufactured to fire 5 rounds, yet police recovered 7 bullets from the scene of the shooting. The direction of Zangara's gun when fired was almost the only point that eyewitnesses agreed on. Zangara was shooting at Cermak, not Roosevelt, as United States Representative-elect from Florida Mark Wilcox and Chicago and Robert Gore, who were both standing only a few feet from Zangara, told a radio interviewer minutes after the shooting he was shooting at Cermak. There is no doubt about that. The killer waited until Mr. Roosevelt sat down and then fired. Reports went out of the wires at once that Cermak had been shot by Chicago gangsters, but after the first day, there were no other mentions of gangsters being involved in the shooting. Later, while Roosevelt waited in the halls of the Jackson Memorial, where Cermak was being treated, he pointed out to his Secret Service detail that not one of the 6 persons shot were near him when they were in fact hit. In fact, he pointed out that they were at least 30 feet away from him, but only 2 or 3 feet away from Cermak. and added Roosevelt Zangara had not fired off a single shot at him while he had a full 8-minute window during his speech. Roosevelt concluded that Zangara was a Chicago gangster sent to kill Cermak, and said as much for the rest of his life. In 1957, Roger Tuohy told the Illinois Parole Board that what really happened in Miami that night was that when Zangara started shooting, there was mass confusion. People were screaming and running, ducking and falling. Everything was just happening, just the way it was supposed to happen. The two syndicate killers, Three-Finger Jack White and Frankie Rio, both wearing badges from Cicero Police Department, waited until Cermak fell wounded, then stepped out from the crowd with their .45s at the ready. In a few more seconds, uniformed police, Secret Service, plainclothes detectives, and Cermak's hired private detectives would all have their weapons drawn, so White and Rio didn't stand out in the mob. They fired their .45 caliber guns towards Zangara in an attempt to silence him, but the shots missed and nicked several bystanders instead. They then slipped out of the crowd of 10,000 confused and frightened onlookers and disappeared. All eyes were on Zangara anyway as the angry crowd leaped on him, and before police could pull him to safety, the rabble they had torn off most of the little man's clothes and beaten him badly on the face and chest. Yet Zangara never released his grip on the pistol despite the beating. When the police were finally able to reach him, they disarmed him, handcuffed him, and tossed him into the trunk of a nearby truck, while 3 enormous Miami policemen sat on him all the way to jail. The Chicago Police Department was certain that the shooting was a mob hit and requested the Miami police round up 18 Chicagoans, all known to be in Miami, 12 of whom were known syndicate associates, and hold them for questioning. However, the arrests were never made. When Chicago reporters followed the lead, it turned out that the request had been canceled by the syndicate's favorite state's attorney, Thomas Courtney, who defended his actions with the confusing statement, quote, "My only interests were to learn if there were any Chicago gangsters involved. Apparently, there were not." From his jail cell, Zangara told a Miami police detective that he had to kill, but he wasn't specific on who he had to kill, because if he didn't keep quiet, he said, "My friends will kill me tomorrow." In sharp contrast to his lifelong behavior, after his arrest, Zangara was voluble and excitable, shooting defiant looks into press cameras. At times, he was almost giddy with joy. The local jailers suspected he was having a mental breakdown, yet doctors who examined him that night declared that he was normal in every respect, even sane. Just hours into their investigation, the Secret Service was already convinced that Zangara was a communist and followed that lead extensively and solely, even though when he asked for his views on socialism, anarchism, fascism, and communism, Zangara replied that they were all foolish. Yet despite the lack of evidence for it, the government's investigators concluded that Zangara was motivated in the shooting by his political beliefs. From his hospital bed in Miami, Anton Cermak insisted that he was Zangara's target. When his secretary arrived from Chicago, Cermak said, "You're alive. I figured maybe they shot up the office in Chicago too." He rallied again when his family arrived and arose long enough to sign a 4.2 million teachers' payroll, but on February 27th, Cermak caught pneumonia of the lungs, which caused the area around the right lung to almost double in size. Up until he lapsed into a coma, Cermak believed that he would recuperate, but at 6:57 a.m., he died. In all, Cermak held out for 19 days in a heroic struggle against colitis, pneumonia, and finally gangrene. Cermak didn't die from his bullet wounds, but it was close enough for Zangara to be placed on trial for murder. Represented by 3 court-appointed lawyers who, although experts in their field of civil law, not one of them had ever tried a criminal case before, the lawyers allowed their client to plead guilty to murder. When he did, the court sentenced him to death. Just 60 days after he was tried, Zangara strutted to the electric chair, which, when he sat in it, kept his feet from touching the floor. The guards placed a hood over his head while Zangara gazed out of the room at reporters, but state officials asked, "No pictures? Well, goodbye. Adios to the world. Go ahead and push the button. Viva Italia." Just seconds before the switch was pulled, Zangara turned to the prison's warden, Leo Chapman, and smiled. Chapman had been one of Zangara's very few visitors in jail, and had become convinced that the tiny man wasn't insane at all, and that he was a member of some sort of secret criminal syndicate. As Chapman had walked from his cell to the death chamber with Zangara, he and the Miami police commissioner asked Zangara if he was part of an organized group that plotted to kill Cermak. "No, I have no friends," he replied. "It was my own idea." But now Zangara grinned slyly at Chapman and said, "Viva Camorra," one of many Italian words for the mafia. He then leaned back in the chair and 2300 volts snuffed out Zangara's strange life. When he told Zangara was dead, William Sinnott, the New York policeman who was injured in the shooting, said, "I still believe he was a member of some secret society. He was no more shooting at Mr. Roosevelt that night than I was, and should be investigated further." Ed Kelly was Chicago's next mayor. When reports found Kelly to tell him he was Chicago's new mayor, Kelly was gambling at a mob-owned racetrack in Havana. When asked if he thought that the syndicate had anything to do with Cermak's killing, Kelly put down his racing form and said, "Boys, let's stop that. From now on, there's no such thing as organized crime in the city of Chicago." And that, ladies and gentlemen, was The Guns of Zangara by John T. Tuohy. Now, I found this to be a fascinating story. Let's hop over to Wikipedia. Let me see. Let's look up Giuseppe Zangara. We'll go to Wikipedia, and we'll see what the official story has to say about Mr. Zangara. All right. So, Giuseppe Zangara, September 7th, 1900 to March 20th, 1933, was an Italian immigrant and naturalized United States citizen who attempted to assassinate the President-elect of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, on February 15th, 1933, 17 days before Roosevelt's inauguration. During a night speech by Roosevelt in Miami, Florida, Zangara fired 5 shots with a handgun he had purchased a couple days before. He missed his target and instead injured 5 bystanders and killed Anton Cermak, the mayor of Chicago. What a fucking crock of bullshit. What a crock of bullshit. This is fucking Wikipedia for you, okay? Let me see. Here we go. Conspiracy theory. While accounts focus on Cermak and the other victims being random casualties of an attempt to assassinate Roosevelt, a conspiracy theory emerged sometime before 1999, originating in Chicago, asserting that Zangara was a hired killer working for Frank Nitti, who was the head of the Chicago outfit crime syndicate. John William Tuohy, author of numerous books on organized crime in Chicago, after reviewing Secret Service records, described in detail in a 2002 article his interpretation of how and why Cermak was the real target and the relationship of the shooting to the rampant gang violence in Chicago. The theory is enhanced by numerous researchers citing their analysis of court testimony asserting Cermak had directed an assassination attempt on Nitti less than 3 months earlier. The conspiracy theory suggests that Zangara had been an expert marksman in the Italian army 16 years earlier, who would presumably hit his target, though sidestepping any issues about Zangara's progressive age and health issues since the time he was in the war, his short stature requiring him to stand on a jostled chair, his experience being with a rifle rather than with a pistol from a great distance, and his own statements regarding his target. Raymond Moley, who investigated Zangara, believed he was not part of any larger conspiracy and that he intended to kill Roosevelt. What a fucking crock of bullshit. Like, do you see how they just twist everything? I love how they, like, oh, despite the fact that there's all this evidence, it is still a conspiracy theory. All right, in popular culture, in 1960, a 2-part storyline entitled The Unhired Assassin on the TV series The Untouchables, actor Joe Mantell played the part of Giuseppe Joe Zangara. This episode, while depicting Zangara's story, throughout focuses mostly on Nitti's plan to kill Cermak with an initial fictionalized attempt in Chicago that is foiled by Elliot Ness and his agents at the end of Part 1. In Part 2, another attempt is made using a contract hitman, an ex-Army rifleman in Florida, which again fails to thank Ness. Suddenly, Zangara's failed and unrelated obsession with killing Roosevelt unintentionally achieves Nitti's goal. The 2-part story was later edited together as a feature-length movie retitled The Gun of Zangara, in 1993 reboot of The Untouchables. Oh, I see. The Gun of Zangara, singular, as compared to The Guns of Zangara, plural, conspiracy. Zangara plays a significant role in the background provided for Philip K. Dick's 1962 novel The Man in the High Castle. This alternate history novel sets... I'm not going to read that. That's nonsense. God, I fucking hate official stories, and I fucking hate Wikipedia, and I fucking hate anybody who denies the truth, which is exactly what's going on here. But That, ladies and gentlemen, is going to wrap it up for today. I'm getting back to the book. Like I said, I'm rewriting 2 chapters. I'm hoping to have it done in the next week or 2. But I wanted to just hop in, drop a little bit of history for you, and then get back to the writing. I'll have another show. What day is today? Today's Friday. I'll have another show sometime early next week or middle of next week. But yes, I do hope to have the book completely finished and ready to go. God, I would say 1 week from today, but that's optimistic. Let's say 2 weeks from today, and that's probably giving me a little bit of room. So thank you guys for tuning in. If you haven't pre-ordered the book, I highly suggest that you do so. Go to buymeacoffee.com/JFK Book. You can order it there, and you'll get my notes, a bunch of chapters in advance, and access to my JFK research chat. So thank you for tuning in, and I will talk to you very soon.